Welcome everyone to MailFuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about Constellation Season 1 Episode 5. It's called 5 Miles Out, The Sound Is Clearest. So spoilers for the episode, and well, I never sort of said I was loving the show last episode. I definitely got the most out of last week's episode in terms of the breadcrumbs and the mystery box stuff and the all the little hints of what's really going on. I don't think this week's was as good or was as captivating and got my mind thinking quite the same way. It was mostly just a continuation of stuff that we kind of already hinted at this point, with some more maybe direct examples of a few things. Jo does go on the run with her daughter. We don't actually get to the cabin until the end of the episode, where it kind of links up with what those sort of bookend scenes were in the first few episodes of being out in the snow. Although, interestingly, there was more to some of it. It was almost like the stuff we got in episode 1 and 2 was kind of condensed and like trimmed some things out, which, admittedly, I do think they played better this time with those extra elements in. There's a moment towards the end of the episode where Alice hears one of the tapes, which is clearly a recording of what we actually saw in episode 1, of Jo being on the station and saying, hello, good morning to her daughter, speaking Swedish. That scene we got in early episode 1, right before the accident. Alice hears that tape and then says, who was that talking? That's not me. I don't speak Swedish. I don't call you mama. I thought that was actually quite good, and I kind of almost feel annoyed that they even put those bookend scenes in the first place, because I felt like by putting them in but sort of taking chunks out of them to try and obscure it, did make it feel a little bit like hollow at the time, and I think you probably could have just not done them in the first place and just sort of waited till we got here naturally in the story. I guess I get that they wanted to tease everything that was going on, and they wanted to try and draw people in with the hints of the multiversal stuff and the warped realities and whatnot. But naturally, it just has a lot more meaning at this point in the show to actually have Alice finally acknowledge and sort of fundamentally say that's not me when she's presented with a piece of evidence of something that happened that she doesn't remember from her mother's point of view. So I think that is it's nice to get to that point. I do think one of the frustrating things about this show is that because some of those bookended scenes at the start kind of spelled some things out that we're doing in the show very early. I definitely felt it in this episode when we had this whole trek where Jo takes Alice to Denmark to see who sent the tapes of the astronaut, or the cosmonaut, I should say, in the 70s. And we have this whole experience of hearing some of these tapes and how kooky this brother and sister are that record these transmissions and have been thinking they've been hearing these extra layers that have been kind of bleeding in, which I don't hate that concept. I was just saying on what review was it? There was another thing I just reviewed in the last week where I was talking about how I really, really like... it was Twilight Zone. How I really like analog signals and how you can find creepy stuff in them when you're doing a horror movie or a sci-fi, and that idea of finding things somewhere hidden in the frequencies and coming through the static. I love that stuff. That stuff's great, and I'm down for echoes of the alternate universe sort of bleeding through in that way. What I didn't like about this entire sort of subplot of this episode was, one, I found this brother and sister, particularly the brother, to be just kind of annoying. They're going for this kind of kooky, they might be crazy because they've been branded criminals for doing all this, and they've spent time in prison, and it's it's to sort of doubt the validity of what they're giving the main characters here, even though we know as the audience that there's probably a lot of truth to what they're saying. But the way that the brother kept sort of jumping in, saying, no, don't show them anything, no one's listening to the tapes, he kept doing that over and over again, and to be honest, after a couple of times, I just started to get annoyed by it. You're fundamentally just making this more frustrating to watch. And I think part of that frustration is that, yes, it's interesting where these tapes that are seemingly recording the other universe occasionally are coming from, and they're always recordings of space. It's not recordings of just anything on Earth. It's something to do with space and being out there that the realities are starting to bleed in some way. Although, interestingly, it also seems to be that you only hear the extra stuff on the tape depending on location. Like, there's, the title of the episode refers to the fact that the brother and sister go 5 miles out on a boat because they get a better, not reception is not the right word, because they're listening to a recording, but something about going out there lets them hear the hidden part better. And we see a better example of it later in the episode, where when Joe's driving, there's just this spot in the road where all of a sudden the hidden part is very clear. It doesn't sound like made up and staticky, like you could mistake it for just garbled noise that someone thinks they're hearing something in. No, it sounds clear as day when she gets to this specific spot in the road. So that's something that's is kind of interesting about this. It almost suggests that there's specific places on Earth where the two realities are entwined or closer together, like hotspots or something like that. So that's a little bit interesting. But anyway, to get back to what I was saying about kind of being annoyed by this brother and sister stuff, is that fundamentally, there's not a whole lot. I mean, there's a couple of new little tidbits about lore that comes out of this. Them talking about a bit more about the cosmonaut going up and like having all these problems, but then she was fine. She was just here as if nothing happened, but they'd heard all these bad things going on. And similar, they say that they heard, the opposite happen with Joe. They heard Al be okay, but then all of a sudden she's the one who's back. So they're clearly hearing the other universe. And it also shows that when the Cal went off, that's kind of where there was maybe a switch specifically with Joe and the one who didn't survive, because it seems like the recording is right up until that point. And that's not to say, I mean, I was thinking about this as well. The Cal itself obviously isn't the cause of all this, because it wasn't there when this happened to all these other astronauts and cosmonauts, including Henry and Bud, right? Like, Henry says in this episode he's worried that the Cal has made it worse, but clearly there was already a natural occurring thing. Well, is it natural? Maybe it's not. Maybe something that happened a long time ago created some kind of rift or something. I don't know. But I think what was frustrating to me about, other than the fact that the characters were just kind of annoying, the brother especially, with his constant interrupting and saying, no, let's not do this, I was finding it kind of frustrating just in the sense that I feel like obviously she's going to get these tapes. We already know from the bookend scenes from earlier in the show, and this is maybe another problem the bookend scenes have given us here, is that we already know she's going to be listening to these tapes. So we know what the outcome of this scene more or less is. So it was very frustrating to spend a lot of time with this kind of bickering with these characters who keep kind of ignoring what Joe or Alice are saying. Alice is getting like scared and asking to go back in. She doesn't want to hear the tape, so she's jumping in and kind of like everyone kept trying to like sort of butt in and talk over each other to get what they wanted. Joe wants answers about where the tapes came from. The sisters, like, you have to listen to these tapes to hear what happened to your other astronaut, and Joe doesn't want to listen to them. Alice doesn't want to be here. Like, every single character is asking for something, and every other character in the scene is ignoring them and just doing what they want to do instead. And at a certain point, it started to be kind of grating to watch. So I did not really enjoy that section of the episode. I was finding it kind of irritating more than anything else. Couple of little snippets, obviously, of lore, like I said, come through it, but by and large, I wasn't all that entertained by it. Obviously, it is interesting. Alice reveals that she's seeing something in her dreams, or she's seeing visions of this woman she's scared of, and she draws the dead cosmonaut, which obviously freaks Joe out. That's interesting. Maybe further goes back to this idea that the reason why Alice might be experiencing anything here is because she was on the call with her mother when the Cal turned on. So as much as I said the Cal didn't cause all of these types of things to begin with, because all these things were happening before it ever existed, at least, I mean, maybe it's responsible for Joe specifically getting involved and wrapped up in all this timey-wimey interdimensional stuff. But I think the reason directly that Alice is linked to it is because she was on the call with her when the Cal, and something about that is rippled down through the signal. And again, like, we're dealing with these recordings. Clearly, something related to all this does exist in signals, in recordings. So, yeah, like that's interesting enough. You know, I'm curious about that. You've also got a lot of drama in this episode with Alice being kind of scared and not really knowing why she's like suddenly on this trip. Joe hides the fact that her dad's injured. You know, obviously at the end of the last episode, I kind of assumed he was dead. It actually turns out he's not. He looks quite bad. Like maybe he's going to be seriously injured instead. Later on in the episode, he's just got some stitches in his head and he's fine. Maybe he got a concussion or something, but he's all right. So that is interesting. Obviously, he is tempted to call the police. It's actually Frederick who talks him out of that because it will ruin Joe's career because it will be public at that point that she is now seeing things. She's technically kidnapped her daughter, and she is, you know, her career will be ruined. She'll never be allowed to do anything in her field ever again. Arguably, she's already on shaky ground here, but that sort of stops him from doing it. So it does show on some level that he does care about her still. So that's something. Otherwise, Joe does ask the Russian cosmonaut that she was with on the station. She phones him and asks him to look into the pills that he was taking. And he finds out that his A pills, you know, the A type, not the B type that Joe was on, were just what they were supposed to be. But it does make him go looking into the medical records of the other cosmonauts that did have the B pills or whatever. Like, he's looking into the medical history of other astronauts. And when he tries to take these files, he's basically just told they don't exist anymore. And it's all treated very kind of secret police hush hush. Like they ask for his clearance, and then she makes a mysterious phone call, and then tells him that he can't get any of them. So definitely there's some covering up here of interest that's going on. But yeah, maybe the bigger thing to talk about with this episode is the Bud and Henry stuff, which goes a little bit further into kind of what's happening with them. It seems like, based on a line that Henry has when he's in the mirror talking to Bud, he says, "You stopped taking your pills, didn't you?" or something to that effect. Which maybe indicates to me that when he is taking these pills, they don't have these crossover events where they're talking to each other. But we also get the sense that Bud doesn't like Henry, and it makes sense. He feels like he got robbed of his universe, that he's been lumped on this side where he's a failure in the eyes of many because his fellow astronauts died. So that makes some sense. There's a scene where Henry goes to Frederick to say that he wants to come after Joe because Joe, amongst other things, stole the Cal, right? When she ran off in the night with Alice, before they left the country to go to Denmark, she went and stole the Cal. So he's very concerned about that. He wants to get that back. But when he goes to speak to Frederick, he has this moment where he kind of like shuts off, and I thought it was Bud taking over, and that seems to be kind of confirmed later on in the episode. Now, whether or not Bud can just straight up like puppet his body, like he's completely back in his universe again, I don't think so necessarily, because it felt quite limited, but it was almost like he got enough control and he made him piss himself. Right in front of Frederick. So you see, like, you know, the wet stain kind of appear, and then he kind of snaps back into being Henry again, and just sort of really coldly says, "I'm going with you, I just need to change." Which got a minor chuckle out of me, because it was he no-sold the fact that he just pissed himself in front of someone. But yeah, so it seems like Bud, you know, does have this vendetta, and he says that he's going to ruin his life, and that he's coming for him. And it doesn't seem to be tied to physical location. In fact, when Henry's on the phone to, I think it must have been Irene, yeah, she talks about how there's this study about particles affecting each other, and how distance is not important, but they will have an effect on one another. So that's kind of what we're seeing with people when it comes to Henry and Bud, is that Bud's having an effect on Henry regardless of where they are physically on Earth. Because we know that Bud's in Los Angeles right now, Henry's in Germany, so it's not like they're in the same place roughly on both Earths or in both realities. They're completely thousands of miles apart. It doesn't matter. So this idea that he can kind of tap into him no matter where he is, and, you know, obviously it's visually being represented by them seeing each other in the mirror, and maybe they are both seeing that. You know, there's been a lot of talk in this show about this observer effect and this idea that they're both seeing this, but I bet you for moment that no one else will be able to see this. Except maybe Joe, because that ties into that moment from last episode, right? Where Joe catches him talking to his reflection, and he has that weird moment where he says curiosity killed the cat, which almost felt like that was Bud saying that, like through his body rather than himself, because it didn't sound like Henry. I think that's interesting. Whether or not he was directly saying that to her, or she was just sort of witnessing something that he was saying otherwise, it's tough to say. But all this Bud and Henry stuff is somewhat interesting. The idea that there's more of a rivalry is compelling, and it does make you wonder: does Henry want to go home? Because Bud, I think, clearly would want to come back to his Earth, because his life on the other Earth as an alcoholic, his family aren't seeing him for Thanksgiving. That's what he spends a few scenes in this doing. He's phoning all of his family saying, hey, I'm taking better care of myself. Can I come to Thanksgiving? And seemingly he's not getting a response. He's very estranged from his family on that Earth. Whereas, well, Henry doesn't seem to necessarily have a lot of family connections per se. He's obviously got a more important position. But, maybe he's clearly obsessed with all this, though, because that's why he spent decades building up to this Cal stuff and wanting to do this experiment. He clearly deeply cares about understanding this. Is it about going home for him, though? Or is it just about understanding it so he can use it or manipulate it? Or just explain what happened to him in some way? Because, yeah, I mean, going through this experience, like, there's been a lot of talk throughout the episodes about how astronauts are very unique, and there's not a lot of people they can talk to about the experience they've went through, because it's such a limited number, in the especially in the grand scheme. They say over 500 people went to space in this episode, but that's over a lot of decades. I mean, that's not really a lot per generation, relatively speaking. So this idea that this specific experience of this like altered reality coming back down into the wrong version of the world, the idea that completely just takes it one step further and isolates them so much that no one will ever believe that they're going through something here. It's probably the most interesting thing about the Alice and Joe stuff for me in this episode, is that when Alice and Joe are in the diner and Joe's trying to get her to talk about the fact that, hey, you said you saw a funeral and you saw the other astronaut be alive and you thought I was dead. Did you see that? And she's kind of hesitant to actually just say, yeah, I definitely saw that. She just kind of sidesteps it by saying, you're here now, so clearly I was mistaken, without adding that last part on, but that's implied. And it was making me really think about how, even though her daughter is kind of experiencing the same thing, no one's ever going to believe them. Like, they'll just think the daughter is being young and going along with her mother, and they'll think that she is being crazy and she's psychotic and she's seeing things that aren't there, or whatever, outside of, again, a few key people like maybe Henry, who has some experience with this and understands it to some extent. I also think, I haven't quite nailed what it is yet, but I think this constant theme of like suppressing and not talking about all this stuff is also something that the show is trying to do. There's a scene with Frederick and Magnus, right? It's the same scene where he convinces him not to talk to the police, but he talks about basically we never talk about the effects of that it takes on the astronauts. Like, they all have kind of worse eyesight when they come back. We just kind of accept that as collateral damage. We don't talk about it. And then an even fewer amount come back and they're burned out. That's how he phrases it. That's how they always say it. Because that's what they were saying back episodes ago, was that, oh, you don't want to burn out rather than, lose your mind, which is really what they're thinking. But it does happen, and they kind of just like accept it. It feels like maybe there's a little bit of commentary there coming through with that particular idea of not taking care of people who've done. Like, you could probably relate this to the military, actually. This idea of like, think of all the stories about soldiers who went to Vietnam and came back, and then they were kind of disregarded by the country and by society when they came back. This idea that your purpose is kind of over and you're not really taken care of anymore. There's maybe a little bit of that kind of creeping in with that side of the plot. So, yeah, I mean, I think my favorite thing about this episode, though, which I do think overall I didn't think was as interesting as last episode. I thought all the concepts the last episode was thrown at, as, the left hand of God, the way that Joe was perceiving certain things from either world, the way Alice was perceiving things from either world, I thought they were more interesting. But what I did like the most of this episode was probably the idea over the course of it that it felt like this Alice and Joe were finding a way to bond, not because they're really mother and daughter and they're feeling that connection, but there's a whole scene in the car towards the end where they're talking about how, as an astronaut, you have to compartmentalize things. So you put a problem in a box and you put another problem in a different box, and you just deal with one at a time, right? So it's not like bottling things up in the same way. It's more about just like you tackle one thing at a time. And Alice starts asking what her various problems are and sort of like, you know, visualizes putting each thing in a box on her little bead tray. And she's talking about these things, and it felt like the characters, even if there's this disconnect, it felt like for both their sakes, they should both want to solve this. And I know that obviously young Alice isn't thinking that way in this sense, but it's this idea that regardless of whether or not this is really her daughter or not, they both kind of want to figure this out and like go back to where they're supposed to be, kind of thing. Even if they can't sort of verbalize that yet, they can't, you know, they can't internalize that thought process yet, because, you know, I don't think even Joe, with all the things she's seen and all these weird moments she's having, I don't think she's fully understood that she has came back to just an outright different Earth, right? Obviously, there's all these hints, and because we're watching a TV show, we have kind of phrased it that way, and we immediately are going, oh, she's in a different reality, and all these things are happening. For her, there's all these weird things, and she's trying to figure it out, and she's trying to piece it together, but I don't think she's quite got to that moment yet where she can just flat out say, I came back to the wrong Earth, right? And I think that'll be a big moment for her when she just flat out believes that and can say that, can, you know, vocalize it and make a nice definitive statement out of it. I think we're still kind of in that territory of her trying to just fully accept and understand that. And at a certain point, I do like the idea of like, well, why shouldn't she work with Alice to try and figure this out? Especially if Alice is also having these episodes, if she's also seeing things. She might be one of the few people that she can actually use as an ally in some ways. But yeah, I think that was just, it felt like it, I think what I liked about it is that it developed the relationship, but not the relationship based on what their mother-daughter relationship was supposed to be before the start of the show, because technically they started the show as strangers, right? This version of Alice and this version of Joe are not the ones that know each other. This working together to try and start solving these problems felt like more the first time that they're kind of working together as a new relationship, as this new woman and girl who have met each other, and they're trying to work through things. And again, not that they're vocalizing all of this and sort of thinking of it that way, but that's how I was kind of seeing it, is like this is them actually starting to try and work through some of these problems, even if they don't understand them yet. Anyway, the end of the episode, after Alice hears the tape and says, that wasn't me, I don't speak Swedish, and all that stuff, which I enjoyed that scene. The final moment is a young Alice in the snow yelling mama, which is what, you know, this world's Alice already said she didn't say. So it's nice to know that beyond the language, we've got another thing she does that kind of signifies which one it is, just so that we can tell quickly as an audience. Hey, I got through all of this without ever saying good Alice, bad Alice, good Magnus, bad Magnus. At least Henry and Bud have different names, although again it's a little confusing because technically Bud is actually Henry, but he's going by Bud because he's in that universe. Anyway, yeah, so obviously advance things a little bit. I'm curious to see what happens with them having the Cal, which also I said earlier on, like they found a spot in the road that the signal came through in really clear. I feel like now that I'm thinking about that, it's probably also got something to do with the fact that the Cal is like right next to it. That's probably like strengthening whatever this connection to the other world is, where we're hearing the other version of what's on that tape. Because that's probably the way it is, right? Is that they're listening to a tape that's a recording, but if it's the tape from the other universe, and you're hearing what that other universe recorded, so you're almost getting the secret second recording from the other side, if that makes sense. Not the B side of the tape, because that's just the real thing. But anyway, so yeah, the Cal's probably got a big thing to do with that, because she's got that with her in the car, and then again at the cabin. Yeah, I'm thinking about that now, because she has that with her the whole time, and it does glow occasionally as if it's doing stuff. So yeah, we'll we'll see. I will say Joe is a little bit of a dick for driving across the ice. Now, I think Alice is a little bit annoying because she's always so serious and she's always kind of whining. But it is a bit of a dick move to drive across the ice when your daughter's clearly scared of doing that. Is it really going to save that much? Like, just go on the road. It's fine. Now, I get the symbolism, of course, is that they get to a crossroads where it's left or right. Or it's not a crossroads, a fork in the roads, I should say. And this is actually a difference. Joe says, "What? There's only one road here. I've never seen two roads here." And Alice is like, "What? There's always two roads here." So that's clearly a difference. But it's this idea that it visually represents going, to one reality and the other. And it's almost like it represents Joe as a character who's going through the middle between both realities, kind of thing. So I get this. I get what it's doing. I get the thing that's happening, but. Anyway, that's my thoughts on episode 5. Curious to see what we get to now that we're kind of like caught up with that opening bookends. Obviously, we didn't go as far as the rest of those bookends, but now that we're in that part of the timeline, if we keep sort of doing more of that stuff, where there's a lot more in between the scenes we saw, I'm really going to like further double down my opinion that the bookends were kind of a mistake in the first place, and that just focusing on the space adventure of like trying to get back, because there's still weird moments in the first 2 episodes without that. Like, you still have her seeing, the dead guy floating in front of her. You still have that moment where she's, someone presses the button to, disengage the pod, and that's kind of supernatural. There's still weird moments aside from the bookends in those first 2 episodes. And I think, I'm starting to think maybe they were just kind of a mistake, and they were just trying to like tease some of the even weirder stuff that was coming later, but it probably would have played better without it. Now that we're actually into this stuff. But we'll see how much of it repeats, because we got a few repeat moments in this episode with new stuff around them. If it repeats a lot of the moments again, going forward, I'll probably still feel that way and, critique it, but we'll see where it goes. That is my thoughts. Thank you very much for joining me. I always appreciate it. You can, of course, hit the like button. It helps out a bunch if you do. And of course, you can also go over to patreon.com/MailFuzzTV, where you can support us for as little as $3 per month and help keep the lights on, help keep all the reviews coming. So thank you very much. Check out the Shogun reviews that I'm also doing right now, plus all the classic shows that come out every week. That is me. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?